You are the wife of a defeated chieftain. The night smells of iron and smoke. The sea wind lashes your face as you press your trembling child against your chest, hiding behind the splintered remains of a shield. The village burns. The long houses that once echoed with laughter now spit black fire into the sky. The shore is lined with corpses, men you once knew by name, their lifeless faces turned toward the gods who did not answer. You hear the crunch of boots on frost and the guttural chants of the victors, Vikings draped in blood and ash, their axes heavy not just with iron but with ritual. You pray for death, you whisper for the storm to take you before they do. But when they find you, there is no blade, only a whisper. The gods will not take you yet. Pan outward. Viking Age Scandinavia, a realm immortalized in sagas of courage, honor, and divine fate. But beneath the songs of Valhalla lay another system. Cold, systematic, and unspoken. A trade in flesh and humiliation where conquest was not the end of war, but its continuation through the bodies of the defeated. If this glimpse into forgotten shadows grips you, hit subscribe and drop in the comments where you're tuning in from. It fuels more unearthings like this. From the 8th to the 11th century, Viking expansion carved fear across half the known world, from the icy coasts of Scandinavia to the sunlit ports of the Mediterranean. Monastery records, slave ledgers, and eyewitness chronicles tell a story far removed from the heroic myths. The women of fallen tribes, especially the wives of defeated chieftains, were not just spoils. They were trophies, instruments of domination designed to erase entire bloodlines. This wasn't chaos. It was policy. Every abduction, every forced union, every humiliation served a purpose: to unmake rival tribes and rewrite their future through lineage and trauma. Their fates were measured not in days, but in generations. When the smoke of battle cleared, the Vikings did not celebrate. They organized. The chaos that outsiders imagined was, in truth, an act of control, an operation honed by centuries of repetition. Every victory was followed by an inventory, every raid a census of suffering. Chroniclers from the monasteries of Lindisfarne to the markets of Hedeby described the same ritual, a systematic procession of captives herded into open squares or along the blood-soaked beaches. The men, those who survived, were separated first, their worth determined by strength or skill. Those deemed useless were dispatched quickly, their corpses tossed into the tide to wash back toward the gods. But for the women, the process was slower, deliberate, cold. The wives of defeated chieftains were singled out first, not for mercy, but for spectacle. Their value wasn't measured in coin alone. They were symbols of power, living trophies meant to erase the memory of a rival's rule. A conquered tribe could rebuild armies, raise new banners, reclaim land, but once its women were taken, its lineage was broken. In that calculation lay the genius and cruelty of Viking conquest, domination not through annihilation, but through absorption. The ledgers recovered from trade ports like Birka and Dublin list human lives beside weights of silver and barrels of grain. 15 females, ages 16 to 20, good health, one record reads in crude runic shorthand. Others are more grotesquely meticulous, cataloging hair color, body type, even temperament. To modernize, these look like shipping manifests. But they were more than that. They were proof of how deeply the machinery of slavery was embedded in Norse society. Historians estimate that up to 10% of the entire Viking population at any given time were enslaved people, many of them women captured from Ireland, the Baltics, and the British Isles. For the wives of chieftains, captivity was the beginning of something worse than death, a living erasure. Their names were forbidden, replaced by mockery or animal titles. They were paraded before the new rulers, forced to stand beside the same banners their husbands had once carried into war. In Icelandic sagas, there are fragments of this cruelty, buried beneath myth. One tale speaks of a chieftain's widow made to serve wine to the men who killed her husband, her hand trembling as they toasted his defeat. Another describes a queen forced to weave the banners of her conqueror, sewing her own humiliation into the cloth that would flutter above her lost homeland. This was psychological warfare at its purest, systematic, euphemistic, and precise. The Vikings believed in power that radiated through bloodlines and memory. To destroy a lineage, they didn't always kill, they rewrote. They forced women to bear children who would never know their true fathers, who would be raised as heirs of the men who enslaved their mothers. This was conquest not of land, but of legacy. Archaeological digs across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic reveal graves where foreign women were buried beneath male warriors, sometimes with iron chains coiled around their ankles, a silent testament to possession even in death. In some mounds, skeletal remains of women were found clasping the weapons of their captors, arranged deliberately as if to mock the power they once defied. The Norse sagas call these bindings of honor, but their meaning is far darker. These were not the honors of a warrior's wife. They were the marks of ownership, of a life reduced to ritualized subjugation. To understand how widespread this was, one must look at the Viking economy itself. The so-called slave trade was not an incidental byproduct. It was the backbone. Human beings were the currency that built the ships, funded the wars, and gilded the halls of chieftains. The women of conquered tribes were traded as commodities from Scandinavia to the Abbasid Caliphate. In the bustling markets of Hedeby, it was not unusual to see Norse merchants haggling over the price of a Frankish maiden with fair hair, or a slavish widow of noble blood. They called it thrall-making, a word that sounds simple, almost domestic. But it masked an industry of terror. Women were forced to wear iron collars etched with their owners' symbols, ensuring that even if they escaped, they could never hide. Chroniclers from Byzantium wrote of Viking captains who branded captives with runes burned into the skin marks of fate, they claimed, as if the gods themselves had chosen who would serve. Yet perhaps the most chilling element was how ordinary it became. For the Vikings, this brutality was not cruelty. It was commerce. The same man who slaughtered in the morning might sit at night counting profits from the sale of captives, his wife beside him wearing jewels once owned by another queen. The system was so ingrained that even sagas written centuries later mention it casually, as if enslavement were a mere fact of life. But not every captive was taken for sale. Some were kept for ritual. The wives of fallen leaders were sometimes offered as sacrifices, not in the fiery haste of war, but in slow, ceremonial deaths meant to please the gods. In one account by Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab emissary who witnessed a Viking funeral along the Volga River, a slave girl was chosen to follow her master into the afterlife. She was intoxicated, paraded through the camp, and finally killed beside his body, her death staged as an act of devotion. What Ibn Fadlan did not see, or perhaps chose not to write, were the countless others forced to live through their master's deaths, their survival deemed a curse rather than mercy. For those women, life became a cycle of exploitation disguised as ritual. Some were forced to participate in blot ceremonies, offerings to Odin or Freyr, where captives' blood was mixed with animal sacrifice. The sagas praise these rites as holy purification, but beneath the poetry lies a grotesque truth. It was often the blood of conquered women that sealed the sanctity of Viking victory. And yet even this cruelty was structured. There were rules, if one can call them that. A chieftain could not simply do as he pleased. There were hierarchies, taxes, even laws governing the ownership of captured wives. Surviving Icelandic law codes from the 10th century include clauses defining how a man could claim rightful possession of a captive woman, provided she was not already owned by another. The penalties for stealing another man's slave wife were harsher than those for killing a free farmer. Death was negotiable. Property was sacred. This was the world after conquest, where humanity was rewritten in ledgers and lineage became inventory. Every raid added to a system that functioned with industrial precision, long before industry existed. And for the wives of defeated chieftains, every day alive was a reminder that death would have been kinder. The Vikings understood something few empires articulated so clearly: terror was the most reliable currency. Once a village had seen what happened to its chieftain's wife, no army could rally there again. The humiliation of the elite was a warning to the commoner. Chroniclers in Ireland recorded entire clans surrendering without battle, haunted by stories of women forced to serve their conquerors at feasts celebrating their tribe's extinction. These weren't isolated atrocities, they were policy. Norse raiding culture functioned on what modern historians call psychological deterrence. A single captured wife, paraded through the enemy's homeland, was worth a dozen burned villages. She became living propaganda proof that resistance was hopeless. In this way, even the act of survival became a weapon. Some captives were integrated into Norse households. But integration was another euphemism. They were displayed beside legitimate wives, dressed in foreign garments, a reminder of the husband's reach. Their children born of coercion were taught to despise their mother's origins. Language was erased, names replaced with Norse words of submission like frilla, concubine, or aetla, bonded one. To ensure loyalty, the Vikings used terror and reward in equal measure. Some women were granted relative comfort if they bore strong sons, while others were cast into the sea once their usefulness waned. Archaeologists excavating Norse settlements in Iceland and Greenland have found runic carvings suggesting record-keeping of fertility cycles. One inscription describes the harvest of wombs, tallying births to enslaved women as if they were livestock yields. Scholars still debate the phrase's meaning, but the implication is unmistakable. Women were systematically bred to sustain a labor force and expand bloodlines. It was empire building through biology. Behind the brutality was cold arithmetic. Transporting captives was expensive. Feeding them, risky. Mortality rates on Viking ships could reach 15%, yet those losses were logged as acceptable. The dead were thrown overboard with the same efficiency used for spoiled grain. One account from a Frankish chronicle describes a raider's ship found drifting near the Seine, filled with the corpses of women still bound together, their wrists tied to ballast stones to keep them from floating ashore. Even death had to be disciplined. Those who survived the voyage faced markets where their fates were auctioned. The Dublin slave market, one of the largest in the Viking world, operated openly for centuries. Traders from the Islamic Caliphate came north to purchase captives, often for gold, silk, or exotic spices. And with every sale, the Norse expanded their legend not through valor, but through commerce built on human misery. Yet the true cruelty lay not in the markets or ships, but in the quiet moments after. The forced marriages, the psychological conditioning. A captive wife was often made to watch her husband's banner burn, then handed the cloth to weave anew under the sigil of her captor. This ritual, documented in fragments from both Norse sagas and Celtic laments, was designed to break memory itself, to ensure that when she bore children, they would not inherit vengeance, only silence. Historians have uncovered legal fragments hinting at how codified this horror became. The Gragas, an early Icelandic law code, includes provisions for ownership disputes over women and children of mixed birth. If a captive bore a son by her owner, that child could inherit property, but only if the mother was later freed, and even then she was often cast out afterward. Freedom was a weapon too granted only when it ensured the bloodline's continuity. There are stories whispered through the centuries, echoes of defiance that slipped through the cracks of history. In the Orkney Islands, a saga fragment tells of a chieftain's widow who drowned herself rather than be taken, her name lost, but her act remembered in local legend as the Silent Oath. In the Baltic, bones of women found bound but unburned suggest ritual suicides prevented by captors, a final cruelty of denying even death as escape. The system was so entrenched that even generations later, descendants of these captive women could be found ruling Norse settlements, their own mother's torment woven into the empire's DNA. Genetic studies of Viking burials reveal non-Scandinavian maternal lineages spread across Iceland, the British Isles, and the Baltic, a living record of conquest etched in blood. Pause and consider that. Empires are remembered for what they built, their ships, their sagas, their gods. But the Vikings built something else, a mythology of domination so complete that it outlived its victims. The sagas that speak of heroes and honor were written by men who inherited their power from women who were never allowed to speak. And so, the circle closed. What began as raids became rituals, and what began as conquest became culture. Each generation of Viking children grew up believing that the suffering of the defeated was a divine order, a law older than man. The wives of fallen chieftains, once symbols of leadership and unity, became reminders that even love, even motherhood, could be weaponized. It was not the sword that conquered them. It was the system, the cold, bureaucratic machinery of dehumanization that turned intimacy into empire. If this chills you as it does me, subscribe for the next shadow we'll unearth. Because history hides its horrors best where they look most human. For centuries, historians romanticized the Vikings as wild seafarers driven by adventure, not ideology. But the closer one looks into the records, the clearer the machinery becomes. This was not chaos. It was governance through terror, an empire without walls, built on rituals of humiliation. The true horror was not what happened in the heat of battle, but what followed once the screams stopped. Among the Vikings, the fate of a defeated chieftain's wife was codified, not improvised. In Old Norse, there was a term rarely spoken in the open tongue, ankenskatt, literally, widow tribute. It was a system of ransom, servitude, and forced breeding disguised as honor. When a rival chieftain was killed, his wife or concubine became the spoils owed to the victor as divine right. Not only did this eliminate her bloodline, but it absorbed her lineage into the enemy's house, ensuring that her descendants would forever serve the name of the man who destroyed her family. The sagas softened these acts with poetic euphemisms, phrases like taken into protection or joined under the new banner. But beneath the language lay cruelty that even the chroniclers struggled to justify. The widows of slain nobles were often paraded before the community, dressed in foreign silks looted from raids in the east, then offered in symbolic marriage to their husband's conqueror. Refusal was treated as blasphemy defiance not just of a man, but of Odin's order. Archaeological digs in Norway have uncovered stone carvings depicting women kneeling before warriors holding spears aloft, a ceremony scholars now believe represented these tributes. One inscription bears the chilling words, "Her silence sealed his victory." To understand how deep this system ran, one must see how religion wrapped itself around conquest. The Vikings saw their world as a cycle of sacrifice, blood feeding gods, gods feeding fate. Every victory demanded offering, and human beings were the purest tithe. In this logic, the suffering of captured women became sacred currency. By the late 10th century, Norse colonies across Ireland and England had institutionalized the practice. Local governors were expected to deliver tributes of women annually, wives, daughters, or widows of rebellious chiefs, as guarantees of loyalty. Records from the annals of Ulster mention gifts of living flesh sent north with the spring fleet, a phrase so grotesque in its calmness that it almost defies belief. And yet, it worked. Fear traveled faster than ships. Villages surrendered long before the sails appeared on the horizon. A single rumor of what awaited the wives of those who resisted could paralyze entire coastlines. Viking domination did not rely solely on weapons. It relied on memory. Those women who survived often became administrators of their own oppression. Some, through forced proximity to power, were made overseers of new captives. They were called husfreyja, house mistresses, tasked with managing domestic slaves. In this way, the cycle perpetuated itself. Victims turned enforcers, humanity twisted until survival meant complicity. It is one of the oldest truths of empire cruelty. Refined becomes order, and order becomes law. The Vikings had no prisons, no bureaucracies of parchment and seal. Their control was written in bloodlines and memory, in the silence of women who could never speak their names again. 600 words. By the dawn of the 11th century, the Viking world had evolved into a network of colonies stretching from Greenland to Byzantium. Its strength no longer lay only in longships but in systems, the predictable, repeatable rhythms of terror that ensured obedience. The fate of conquered women was the dark heart of that rhythm. Even Christianity, when it reached the Norse world, did not erase it. It refined it. In Icelandic Christian law codes, widows taken in conquest were labeled redeemed property, meaning their captors could marry them under the church's blessing if a donation was made to the bishopric. In effect, spiritual institutions legalized what the sword had taken. Grace, the priests called it. Continuity, the chieftains said. The women called it nothing at all, because their voices were not written. The sagas record chilling examples of how normalized this became. In Laxdala saga, a woman named Melkorka, an Irish princess captured in her youth, bore a son to her master and later rose to prominence in Iceland. The text treats her enslavement as incidental, her silence as virtue. Her descendants became nobles, their lineage celebrated. But what the saga never says is that her nobility was founded on the obliteration of another kingdom. Melkorka's story is the sanitized version of thousands like her, a myth carved from trauma. Even entertainment became an extension of control. During annual things, the Viking assemblies where laws were declared and disputes resolved, captured noblewomen were sometimes displayed before the crowd as proofs of divine favor. Chroniclers from Anglo-Saxon England describe such scenes in horror. Women made to serve mead at the tables of the men who killed their kin, their composure paraded as evidence of order restored. Pause and consider that for a moment. Entire societies built festivals around the humiliation of the conquered. The suffering of women was transformed into ritual, an aesthetic of obedience. And once ritualized, it no longer looked like cruelty, it looked like culture. At the height of their power, Norse leaders calculated human lives with chilling precision. One record from Hedeby notes, to yield 100 fit for breeding, 1,000 must be taken. 9 in 10 were expected to die during raids or transit. These were not tragedies, they were logistics. To them, efficiency was a form of faith. By the 12th century, when Viking rule had faded into legend, the legacy of their system endured, woven into the laws and bloodlines of the lands they once ravaged. In the genetic record of Northern Europe today, entire clusters of maternal DNA bear foreign signatures, echoes of women carried from the British Isles, from Slavic coasts, from Frankish villages. Their descendants walk among us, the proof of a conquest that was as biological as it was territorial. This was the Viking miracle. They built no marble cities, left few written laws, yet their dominion persisted in the most intimate space of all the human body. Power had found its most enduring vessel. Pause again. History celebrates ships, weapons, kings. But what if the true monuments of empire are the silent generations born from coercion? What if victory is measured not in banners raised, but in blood rewritten? That is the final revelation. The Viking world did not die. It dissolved into us. Its violence was not extinguished, only inherited. If this descent into the heart of systemic cruelty compels you, subscribe and share your thoughts below. Because the next empire we unearth may look disturbingly familiar. Centuries have passed since the long ships vanished from the northern seas, since the sound of oars and battle horns faded into myth. Yet the ghosts of those women remain. Their stories were never written, only whispered through the generations, through lullabies sung in borrowed languages, through faces that bore no resemblance to the land that claimed them. Archaeologists find their bones beneath Viking farms and call them artifacts. But they were not relics. They were people whose entire existence became a ledger entry, a line in a trade route, a silence carved into the foundation of empire. History remembers the Vikings as explorers, traders, poets of the sea. But for those who lived beneath their rule, the legacy was not adventure. It was survival against erasure. The wives of defeated chieftains became unwilling architects of the new world, forced to give birth to the very lineage that had destroyed their own. Their blood became the mortar of empire, their silence its song, and still, fragments of truth endure. The sagas that glorified the conquerors cannot fully hide the tremor beneath their verses. The quiet mention of a foreign woman, the child with an unfamiliar name, the whispers of shame disguised as fate. Even in the Norse myths of Valhalla, there are moments of unease, where warriors boast of conquest so loudly that the gods themselves seem to turn away. The horror of what was done to those women was not in the spectacle of violence, it was in the normalization. The system worked because it taught entire generations that domination was destiny, that blood was currency, that empathy was weakness. And that is the most enduring danger of history's darkest chapters, when cruelty learns to disguise itself as order. Today, geneticists tracing Scandinavian ancestry find maternal lines stretching deep into lands once plundered. The past is not buried, it breathes in us. The bloodlines of the conquered and the conquerors have long since intertwined. But memory does not fade so easily. Somewhere within the collective human soul, the echo of those forgotten wives remains. A warning, a reckoning, a reminder that power, when unchecked, always finds the most intimate ways to corrupt. If this history stirs something in you, if it compels you to remember those who had no voice, subscribe and share where it hit hardest in the comments. Because every name we recover, every silence we break, is a small act of rebellion against oblivion. The archives endure, the ledgers of misery still exist, and the task before us is simple but sacred, to read what the conquerors tried to erase.